Welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Dane Waters. It's another great week around the world for us to many things to talk about as always. But I have to one disclaimer to begin with is that I've been on the plane for the last traveling for the last 19 hours, so I probably may not be the most what's the word I'm looking for? The most spry host today. But luckily we have a guest who loves to chat and loves to talk, so I won't have to talk as much today. But before we get to Gareth, let's talk about what's happening around the world. In the United States, and we really need to have a show on this, is that I think we're heading for I don't want to say constitutional crisis, but I think we're heading toward an era where we're going to have to define what is the role of the president, what is the role of the courts. As we all know, President Trump has made several new executive orders. And his new organization called Doji, led by Elon Musk, is dabbling in a lot of things that many people argue that he shouldn't. So many lawsuits have been filed, and the federal courts have already come out and say, hey, you must give the money, you must do this, you must do that. And as of now, the Trump administration is ignoring the court's rulings. And just recently, the courts came out with another statement that said, ignore us at your peril. Now, the question then becomes, what can the court actually do to force Trump to do certain things? I don't know, but I do believe that we're going to see, a challenge to the judicial system by the presidency, and we'll see what comes out. Major things happening there. In addition to that, we will, what's happening around the world. And I think that tariffs, everyone's going to get hit by tariffs. Now, what that does to the American consumer, who knows? What that does to the American budget, who knows? But Donald Trump has this intention, which he wants to cut taxes, which, hey, I hate taxes. I'd be happy if he cut taxes. But at the same time, he's looking for ways to increase revenue to offset those tax cuts. And I think that he's looking at tariffs as a way to do that. Now, whether or not that is a good strategy or not economically, who knows? But the interesting thing about what's happening, no matter how you feel about President Trump, is that he's trying things that are new. Now, whether they're good or bad is up to the individual to decide, but definitely a lot's going on, and we'll have to see how that comes out for the American public. Now, foreign policy-wise, this is where this show takes a deeper look. And one of the things we'll be talking about on this show is the Middle East, what is happening in Syria and Lebanon, and now Israel with Hamas saying that they're not going to release additional hostages. And so there's just a lot going on in that regard. Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Dane Waters. Now, the lighting, as you can see, is not that great. So listen, I wish I could say that I've been out in the sun and have a deep, dark tan, but I don't. So just ignore my redness today. It could be that I'm just embarrassed because our next guest is going to be just so much smarter than I'll ever hope to be. Well, I want to say welcome, Gareth Browne. Hey, Gareth, how are you?
I'm great, Dane. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Gareth is it's not the Middle East correspondent for The Economist, but you're the correspondent for The Economist, right? I guess. I mean, what's the official title for you these days?
One of. There's a whole team covering the Middle East, and I'm merely a piece in that puzzle.
Well, you're a good puzzle maker, I have to say that. So, uh, Gareth you're the first foreign journalist to interview the new president of Syria. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was yeah, part of a team. There was I mean, The Economist was the first outlet to interview the new president of Syria since he became president, and I was part of that team. Yeah.
Okay, well, let me just say this. The Economist is a magazine. It's a physical document. It didn't interview anybody, okay? You did the interview. So you're very modest, and I respect that, but let's just, give credit where credit's due. I look at that little smirk and that grin on your face there. So, so tell me about him. I mean, what do you just describe him as a human being? Because I have lots of questions, and so let's just get started there.
Yeah, I'd say he wasn't. I'm not sure what I expected, but he didn't. Whatever those expectations were, he was very different. He was quite a quiet man. He spoke really softly. Almost you had to sort of lean in to be able to hear him. Um, his story is one of a sort of an incredible arc, which follows, really the core events in the Middle East in the last 25 years. He grew up in Damascus in a relatively secular and wealthy neighborhood, and a lot of the people he grew up with went into the army or the civil service, or they became diplomats, lawyers. But he became religious. He was radicalized essentially by the Second Intifada. That's the Palestinian uprisings against Israel around the year 2000. He was radicalized. Then he went off to Iraq, ended up in Al Qaeda, a very senior member of Al Qaeda, and was then sent by Al Qaeda in Iraq to Syria to establish an Al Qaeda franchise in Syria. And now he's president of the country. And he played not a minor role, a very major role in Al Qaeda and some of the most radical groups in Syria. But it didn't really measure with, the man I sort of sat down with for about an hour last week. I think the word that you hear people use a lot is pragmatic. And that sort of defines his the last 20, 25 years of his life, let's say. So now he's, the sort of jihadi headbands have gone, the camo. He's not presenting himself as a military leader. Now he's wearing quite nice suits. He had quite a nice watch on, Italian shoes. So you see this transition, which I think has played out ideologically within him, or let's say, at least within his worldview, but also like physically, he's gone from militant to president to statesman. But one thing you would hear a lot from Syrians who have met him, he's met a lot of Syrians since they captured Damascus on December 8th. He's been hosting these sort of majlises where people just come and meet him and talk. And they all say he's really charismatic. And he didn't strike me as particularly charismatic in our meeting. I mean, he was interesting. He was smart, clearly very religious, very conservative still. There was almost something shy about him. And I dare say there's an element of him being overwhelmed. I think that was the sort of feeling I got from him and the people around him. I think they've succeeded beyond their wildest imaginations. And I think you could feel that a little bit in our meeting.
Well, so about this being overwhelmed, do you think that, I mean, listen, running a country is not easy, no matter how big or small the country is, right? So, do you think that he has the ability to run the country? And then I guess also more importantly, it's not just about running the country. Do you believe that what has happened is in the best interest of Syria? Do you think that he is going to allow greater freedoms than the previous administration did?
I think he can do it, absolutely. I mean, look, the Assad regime, which fell on December 8th, obviously we had, 20, 25, 24 years of Bashar and his father before that, 54 years of dictatorship. And really, we're starting to like shine a light on some of the worst excesses and crimes of that regime. And when you look at what's just fallen, the bar was so low. I mean, I've spent time reporting in mass graves and in the torture rooms, and really, it's like nothing could be worse than that. So personally, I think that whatever comes next will be a net gain. But then the question then is how much of a gain? What percentage of Syria's potential is going to be really, reached with this new administration, with Ahmed al-Shara, the new president, running the show. They actually did quite a good job of running Idlib, which is like the rebel-held sort of province in the north of Syria, which they kind of set up a sort of interim government there. They were quite effective. I mean, you'll like this. Like on the business front, they cut taxes, made it really simple to do business. Just sort of had a flat tax rate. They let a lot of the
I'll support him already if he has a flat tax
yeah,
rate.
it was really there's a lot of development if you go to Idlib, which was like this backwater province, and they just let sort of private capital do its thing. But it was so different running Idlib. That was much smaller. It was more ethnically homogenous. You didn't have all these minority groups to deal with. You could sort of, I think, from what I understand, basically the government in Idlib was basically run out of one building. And if you needed to, go and speak to what was essentially the Minister of Agriculture or Transport, you'd walk across the corridor and there he was. And now, they've got a country with more than 20 million people, ministries, institutions. And I think the mistakes they've made in the first 2 months, we're about 2 months in now, is that they started trying to run Syria like the same way that they ran Idlib. And for sure, there's some lessons that they can take from their governance of Idlib, but there's so much of that experience doesn't apply to running this huge country, where you've got minorities, Alawites, Christians. You've got a very secular sort of population in Damascus, the Damascus elite who are not interested in the sort of the Islamist values that someone like Ahmed Ashara would be associated with. And then you've got the foreign policy as well, you know. So there's so many other challenges, but I think they can do it. I think one thing you do here, which this is a source of optimism for me, even if things aren't sort of firing on all cylinders at the minute, is he does listen to criticism and he takes on board advice. Maybe a bit too much. Maybe there's an element of him being pulled in so many different directions.
Yeah.
But there have been a few instances in the last month, 6 weeks, where they've made a decision and they've come under heavy like criticism publicly, and then they've changed course. And I think that's quite promising. That's quite rare in the region. You know, that's sort of associated generally with weakness. But from what I've seen, they've been willing to listen not just to their people, but to outside powers, to traditional stakeholders in Syria, big families, businessmen, trade unions. They're hearing them out, and I think that's a reason to be positive.
Do you think that he can, with that diverse? I mean, Syria is a very diverse country, right? I mean, there's a lot of I don't know. You get the Turks involved. You got you just got a lot of different factions in the country. I mean, do you think is he capable? Do you think the country is going to be able to stay solidified, or do you think there's a chance that it could break up? Or are those just unfounded concerns?
I mean, look, Syria has been de facto partitioned for the last 10 years. You have the Kurdish region in the northeast. You had areas under Assad's control. You had the rebel-held enclave that I was talking about, Idlib. So I mean, in many ways, Syria was already de facto partitioned. I think something that he mentioned and other senior people around him, that they do talk a lot about, they look for other examples elsewhere. So Afghanistan and the Taliban, they go, look, we don't want that. We don't want to be isolated in the way they have been. They talk about the de-Baathification in Iraq in 2003. Like, we know what mistakes the Americans made there. We don't want that. So I think they're learning from other people's mistakes. I think he recognizes and accepts the fact that if you try to completely marginalize Syria's minorities and just run it as a sort of hardline Sunni autocracy, it will fail. I think he understands that all these minority components are pretty integral to Syria, as a nation, as a state. But I think the strategy is like, even if you don't like him now, the situation in Syria is so bad. The two big things they have to deal with is the economy and security, and we can talk about these in more depth. But you have probably one of the most oppressive and suffocating sanctions regimes in the world in place on Syria. So that makes sort of economic growth very, very difficult. And then you have this security situation where, okay, they control Damascus, but they don't control the whole country at the minute. And I think they're banking on the fact that if they can improve those two things, people will get on board, even if they're not, Islamists or even Muslims. I think minorities, Alawites and Christians, Druze will get on board if just life starts to get better. So at the minute in Damascus, you have 1 or 2 hours of electricity per day from the government. If you can double that to 4, people will get on board with the new administration. The people that aren't on board with the administration now will get on board. So I think they're relying on it being a sort of output-driven administration. That's how you win people over, by making their lives better, instead of trying to convince them ideologically or anything like that.
Well, who do you think, which foreign country now has the greatest influence there? I mean, the Russians have left; they've had to leave, right? Is it, I keep hearing about the Turks, having an active role in the country. So is it a country now that has an external force that's really trying to drive him, or is he really pretty much independent and free to do as he wishes?
I think it's somewhere in the middle. Turkey has played a huge role in allowing HTS to become what it is today. Controlled that border with Idlib and they're an important partner for the new Syrian government, but he's not a Turkish proxy. I think it would be very wrong to kind of draw that conclusion. Um, I'm hearing more and more noise about the Gulf states as well, Saudi Arabia and Qatar in particular. He wants to draw them in, get them involved. They were traditionally kind of, players in Syria, and they sort of lost interest under Bashar. Um, but I think he's quite shrewd about this actually, because he doesn't want to be in anyone's country's camp. So it's not that he's playing all these regional powers off against each other, but he's trying to make sure that Syria now isn't beholden to any one state, as it has been for the last 15 years to Russia and Iran. So his sort of mantra is, look, we'll deal with anyone, we'll interact with anyone, even the Russians, even the Iranians, if it's in Syrian interest. So yeah, they want support from the Turks, but they also want to balance that with support from Saudi Arabia, um, Qatar as well. Qatar would be more closely aligned with the Turks on various issues in Syria. So he's even wants to speak to the Americans, which is amazing considering he was in an American jail in Iraq for 5 years. So it's about balancing the regional powers and not letting anyone become too dominant, which I think is quite a smart move, because that is what has been the case for the last 15 years, and it's been to the detriment of the Syrian people.
Well, how important is it for Syria to have a positive relationship with Israel? And what is that relationship now, um, since he's taken over?
It's a very interesting question. Um, I think that it's not priority, frankly speaking, but he did another interview after the interview that we did, and it was on a British podcast by Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, and he used the word Israel. Um, and he didn't. Usually, someone like him would probably use the term, I don't know, Zionist entity or the Zionist aggressor. They would never actually use the word Israel, but he said Israel. He's made it really clear that he doesn't want to fight with Israel, and I've heard this from other like officials around him. They have no interest in going to war with Syria with the Israelis, because they know they would lose. That said, Israel has, in the 2 months since Assad fell, moved beyond the Golan Heights, the occupied Golan Heights. That's, Syrian territory that the Israelis occupied in 1967. Then there was an armistice agreement, and now they've moved beyond that and are, occupying villages beyond the Golan, and they seem to be pushing and pushing and pushing. And I think that's worrying. He really doesn't want that fight. But you wonder how much the Israelis are going to push, and at which point he has to sort of react in some ways. But I think there might be there's of course a natural, I guess, Israeli tendency to be very skeptical of the Islamists. Whenever an Islamist government has come into power, it hasn't been particularly good for Israel. And I'm not sure that's the case here, because I think this goes back to him being a pragmatic leader, a pragmatic official. And I think if he can find a way in which it's in the interests of Syria and the Syrian people, there's a deal to be done with between Syria and Israel. And I'm not suggesting that Syria is immediately going to normalize or join the Abraham Accords or anything like that. But I think there's grounds for progress. Especially if that's the price for getting US sanctions lifted, some sort of American support, or I think these guys would open up a little bit to the Israelis. So there's some potential there, but it's not a priority. For now, he's trying to get the economy on its feet, sort out all these security issues. There's other regional powers he's going to do business with in the immediate term. But I think the Israel conversation is one that's going to happen over the next 5, 10 years. And it will be much more dynamic than it was under the Assads.
Well, I mean, okay, we have a couple more minutes before we take a break. So let's talk about, Hamas, Israel, how they're still, everyone was optimistic about the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. But, Hamas just came out, earlier today or yesterday, and said that they are not going to deliver any more hostages, dead or alive, because Israel is not honoring the ceasefire agreement. I mean, what do you think is going to happen now?
Hard to know. I was skeptical that this ceasefire would ever get beyond stage one. Um, I think I mean, look at what Hamas came out and said. They basically said that they were giving it until Saturday, right? So this ceasefire hasn't ruptured yet, although you'd think it might have if you looked at Donald Trump's comment last night. But
Yeah.
there's still 3 4 days to figure this out. Hamas is complaining that not enough aid is coming into Gaza, essentially. So if that can be fixed, then maybe the ceasefire goes on. But I always thought that this agreement, which was, I think, it was fascinating to see this agreement reached between Israel and Hamas, because actually what it showed was how inept the Biden administration was. The variable was Trump, and Trump's pressure sort of hammered down the final deal. But I always thought this deal was gonna get, you do stage one, and then it would enter this phase of, as sort of Kissinger would have described it, constructive ambiguity. So this ceasefire, which was 3 stages, was never going to reach stage two or stage three. But that didn't necessarily mean we were going to fall back into the sort of all-out bloodshed that we've seen over the last 15, 16 months in Gaza. And I think this is probably part of this. I don't, until Trump spoke last night, and now I think Trump's made it clear that if Israel wants to go hell for leather back in Gaza, then they can do that, but that won't get the hostages back. I don't think that will defeat Hamas, and I just think that will further isolate Israel more internationally. But it remains to be seen. I think they'll probably be. I think it will still remain in stage one. I think they're going to figure something out in the next few days, get more aid into Gaza, and Hamas will end up releasing more hostages on Saturday, and we'll sort of kick this problem down the road for a few weeks or a few months' time.
Well, the argument is that honestly, not many of the hostages are still alive. So, but I guess most Israelis are accepting that fact, probably. Listen, we need to take a quick break here from Around the World with Dane Waters. Gareth and I will continue this conversation because I have a lot to ask about Donald Trump and Middle East policy. So let's take a quick break and we'll be back in a minute. Thank you.
What we've always maintained is the never Trump movement. I'll break it down a bit. Syria, Lagos has become one of the largest exporters of Egyptian ivory in the world.
Of the third world nation, where your votes will get stolen if you can vote there at all.
Welcome back I'm sorry, I'm just here laughing because I'm having to watch Gareth and all that he's doing. So excuse me for my laughter. Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. I'm your host, Dane Waters. Little did we know we'd also have entertainment, not just my entertainment, but Gareth's entertainment. So let's talk about, Donald Trump. I mean, listen, I just want let's just deal with the facts here. Yeah, he did come out yesterday and say, listen, if the peace deal fell apart, he said there'd be hell to pay. I don't know his exact words, but basically that, I guess he would get involved into the issue. But if the U.S. were to take an active role in attacking Hamas in Gaza, I mean, what impact would that have perception toward America? Is it going to engender more animosity toward us, or what's the feeling of America in the Middle East these days under Trump?
I think on the issue of the Palestinians, it probably couldn't really get much worse. So, America playing a direct role in Gaza, I think I'm not sure how much of a difference it would make, to be honest, because I think around the region, America is seen as being hand in glove in Israel, which is quite hard to imagine how it could be seen as being even closer. Probably encourage more resentment. This is the problem: is how much of this is these ideas, these words coming out of Trump's mouth, how much of that is just rhetoric and a bargaining chip, and how much of it is actually an idea? And I think look at the tariffs, right? With Canada, you had these announcements on tariffs with Canada and Mexico. I think it was the issue with Venezuela as well, the plane loads full of migrants. Trump came out with a very, very strong, very scary initial bargaining position, and it worked. It was a very, very successful sort of negotiating tactic. So is his kind of comments about Gaza the same, or does he genuinely want to see America take over Gaza and see all the Palestinians relocated, which of course would be a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, it'd be a war crime, it's forcible displacement of people. We don't know. I mean, I've always thought that a big issue on the Palestinian side is the political stagnation, which is more to do with Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And that's something that has fed Hamas's popularity. Palestinians are really fed up with that political stagnation. Now, perhaps this sort of rhetoric from Trump is something that could shift that, could somehow unblock the Palestinian domestic political stagnation, which opens up a path for credible Palestinian leadership, which is not Hamas. So if that's the case, it could be quite positive actually, and it could nudge some of the regional actors, particularly Egypt and Jordan, who have also contributed to this political stagnation, to shift things, and maybe it develops another political tract and a more credible sort of strand in the Palestinian leadership that's not Hamas that you can deal with. However, if it's not just rhetoric and he's actually serious about these things, I think it's undeniable how enduring the sort of Palestinian cause has been, despite everything. Hamas is still in Gaza. Millions of Palestinians are still living in Gaza. The Palestinian issue is so close to the heart of many Arabs and Muslims around the world. I think before the war in Gaza broke out, before that attack by Hamas on southern Israel on October 7th, there was a lot of talk about potential normalization between Saudi and Israel. And I think there was this sort of idea that the world had stopped caring about Palestinians or the Palestinian issue, let's say. And I think that's undeniably been proven false. Now, this is an issue that is very dear to the hearts of not just Palestinians who are involved directly, but Arabs and Muslims worldwide. And I think if America is to sort of go to war with the Palestinians or directly on behalf of Israel, you're not just fighting you're not just fighting the Palestinians or Hamas in Gaza. You're always picking a broader fight. The kind of enemies you're picking up by doing that are unintentional, far more unintentional than you can imagine. So it's very risky.
Well, the King of Jordan is supposed to be in the United States, I think, next week for a meeting with the president.
Okay. No?
And what did you know that?
I thought it was this week. I think it's today or tomorrow.
Well, that's right. Well, it is this week. I see. I've been on a plane. I don't even know what week it is. So yes, this week, not next week, because today is Tuesday. He's threatened tariffs or taking aid away. Excuse me, not tariffs. He's threatened taking aid away from Jordan and Egypt if they don't take in the Palestinians in Gaza, which they've steadfastly refused to do. And then he wants to turn Gaza into a real estate development with a golf course and all that great stuff. It's just mind-boggling. Any of us who've been to Gaza, just first of all, I think I would invest my money elsewhere, not necessarily in Gaza. But do you think Jordan or Egypt will give in and take the Palestinians?
I mean, this is fast becoming an existential issue for both of those countries. In Jordan, more than 50% of the population are already Palestinian refugees. And in Egypt, you have, a very autocratic military regime, which is deeply fearful and suspicious of Islamists, i.e. Hamas. I think that they will both push back on America before they, I don't think this is a red line that they can cross. If they take in, I think if Jordan takes in a significant number of Palestinian refugees, because of American pressure, it's a pretty high likelihood that monarchy collapses. And I think there's similar problems could easily. Egypt has less of a demographic issue because it's a much bigger country. Was it 80 million? So in theory, it could absorb more Palestinians without sort of jeopardizing its stability. But I mean, even if that were the case, this is still a war crime. You know, who's asking the
Yeah.
Palestinians where they want to go and if they want to be displaced? It's a breach of the Geneva Conventions. So, you know, even if you can convince people to do, the fundamental fact is it's still President of the United States is openly advocating for war crimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's from a practical standpoint. Let's just play it out. Let's say that Jordan agrees and Egypt agrees. I'll take 2.5 million Palestinians in Gaza, whatever the number is. Then somebody has to make them leave. I mean, just because somebody's willing to accept you doesn't mean everyone's going to leave. And
Mhm.
what if only 1 million of them leave and you're still left with 1.5 million in Gaza? Is somebody going to go in there and force them out? Are they going to push them out across the border? I mean, just the sheer mechanics of something like this is just not even feasible. And once again, you're right. That is a war crime because you was just like the United States. We would be accused of a war crime for what we did to the Native Americans, where we literally pushed them out if the ICC existed way back then. But let's switch gears to another neighboring country, to Lebanon. I mean, you're talking about America. What I hear is that, in the formation of the new government there, America was pretty heavy-handed in making sure that Hezbollah didn't have representation, that they really pushed them all to have the representation, which are the two major Shia groups in the country. But what do you make of the new government there? And are you optimistic?
Yeah, there's some very impressive new names in this government. Some very impressive old names too. I mean, this is all we saw last summer. Israel came out of the blocks hard, and you know the campaign, the military campaign they fought against Hezbollah was frankly devastating. It was a very very impressive piece of well, military operation, military strategy, military intelligence gathering. I think they broke a lot of paradigms, how they perpetrated that. I mean, just the complete opposite to what they've done in Gaza. The precise and discriminate nature of their campaign against Hezbollah, and now Hezbollah is sort of starting to feel the political consequences of that war. Um, and essentially, what you had is Lebanon had been without a president for 2 years. The president is elected by the parliament, and Hezbollah and its allies had a blocking, not a majority, but a blocking contingent within the parliament. So any presidential candidate that they didn't like, they could just say no, and they blocked it for 2 years. And then you had General Joseph Aoun, he's a Christian, he's head of the army, and he's widely seen as sort of being more pro-Western, very good terms with the Saudis, more anti-Hezbollah, more of a believer in the classic Lebanese state, as it was before, Hezbollah began to dominate all its institutions, sort of from the 90s onwards. And off the back of Israel's military victory over Hezbollah, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, other senior Hezbollah people, you had this sort of concerted effort by the US, France, and Saudi Arabia to get into the presidency. And I was really skeptical. I didn't think this would work, but it did work. And, then President Aoun approached Nawaf Salam, who's now prime minister. And, he's a very accomplished lawyer. He was on the ICJ. Interestingly, he was directly involved in the ICJ case against Israel, for Israel's crime or alleged crimes in Gaza. And now he's put together this cabinet, which is really quite technocratic. And, I know a few people in that cabinet quite personally. And, there's some pretty strongly anti-Hezbollah people in key positions. I think the main sticking point was the Ministry of Finance. And that was something that Hezbollah and its allies really wanted to keep control of. And so in the Ministry of Finance, you now have this gentleman called Yassin Jabbar, he's a Shia. I think he's actually a British citizen as well, lived in London for a long time. And if he is the extent of Hezbollah's influence I think he's a pretty good man. I think he'll be a pretty competent minister. Obviously, it remains to be seen, but he really understands the challenges that Lebanon is facing. But if he is the extent of Hezbollah and its allies' real authority and influence in this new Lebanese government, I mean, that's a big win for the US, for Saudi Arabia, for France, for the Western powers who want to pull the Lebanese state out of the clutches of Hezbollah. I don't think he's an individual who's really beholden to them. And he's competent. He'll be able to do the job. So there's reasons to be optimistic. But I also, in some ways, I'm actually more pessimistic about Lebanon than I am Syria or indeed some other countries. And I'll explain why. The issue in Lebanon is that Hezbollah is we see that as a potent military actor. You know, it's dragged the country into wars against Israel. Um, but Hezbollah have done so well in Lebanon in the last 15 or 20 years because they basically concocted a series of deals with the country's political elites. So almost all of the, with some exceptions, but a huge like chunk of the political elites, and I'm not just talking MPs and leaders of parliaments, but the business elites, the all the people that were players in the country, many of them basically cut deals with Hezbollah over the last 15, 20 years, and they have a lot to lose by having like a truly democratic, a return to secularism or some form of secularism, like this sort of Lebanon that a lot of the world wants to see. A lot of the elites in Lebanon would stand to lose. So here you have to untangle not just Hezbollah from the state, from the Lebanese state and all its social institutions, but you also have to untangle all of the political and business elite who have cut deals with Hezbollah over the last 20 years. And that's far more difficult because that's across society, it's across sects. In some ways, it's a far more comprehensive challenge, but so far so good. I think it's moving in.
But let's talk about so Iran, though, the biggest benefactor of Hezbollah. I mean, now that Syria, a lot of the arms and support that was given to Hezbollah came through Syria, but now that that is practically gone, how is Hezbollah getting support from Iran, or are they still getting support from Iran that you know of?
Well, I'm sure there is some support going in, but it's leveled the playing field massively. I mean, we've heard quite a few reports of Iranian officials being stopped at Beirut airport, with bags full of cash and being sent back to Iran. So this is obviously funding or support that was coming to Hezbollah. The weapons shipments, which were just coming thick and fast through Syria over the last 15, 20 years, it's not happening anymore. The new Syrian government and they're not going to allow that to happen. So in that regard, it's sort of leveled the playing field. And now Hezbollah need to act like every other political party in Lebanon. They don't have this huge external benefactor. And I think if you're the Iranians, what do you do now with Hezbollah? Do you try to rebuild it under fire? I mean, it took you 15 years to build up an organization which was essentially wiped out, well, the leadership of which was wiped out in a matter of weeks. And you're going to try and do that again? I think if I was Iran, I'd probably see Hezbollah as a chip to cash in at some point in the coming future. That's a chip you can give up, if there's going to be negotiations of some sort, whether with the Europeans or Americans. I think the role of Hezbollah as that like potent Iranian proxy in Lebanon is dead, but that doesn't mean it's not still a real challenge to the rest of Lebanon. It still does dominate in many ways politically in the country.
Well, let's talk about Iran then. Donald Trump in his first administration, he definitely took action against Iran. I mean, Iran is. I mean, do you think? I mean, listen, Netanyahu in Israel, they've basically gone after every enemy they've had. Iran is still sitting there. Do you think there's a chance that Israel may try to take action against Iran, their nuclear facilities? And if so, I mean, given Donald Trump's history with Iran, do you think America would get involved in that?
I think almost certainly there'll be a strike on Iran in the coming months. I think the question is, will Israel do it? I think Israel can do it on its own. But I think there is something you do here in Israel is that there's some people in Israel that think they can convince Trump to do it. It could actually be a US-led strike, not just a US-supported strike, probably on the nuclear facilities. I think it's absolutely going to happen. It's just a case of can Netanyahu convince Trump that if the Americans do it, I think the Israelis would love that. Take some of the flack, and they've got they've sort of got the tech, the gear, the military capability to do a more effective strike. So yeah, I think that's absolutely going to happen. It's just that is the question now. Is it a US-led strike? Is it an Israeli strike with US support? Is it done in conjunction? Sort of depends on how convincing Netanyahu can be to Trump, but I'd be very surprised if that hasn't been done in the next 2 or 3 months.
Well, listen, I think he's very convincing. I think Trump, listen, America just approved a $7 billion aid package, military aid package to Israel without going through the proper approval processes. I mean, so the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu, even Netanyahu said it's never been stronger. And I think Trump would concur with that. I think that the timing of Trump talking about Gaza with Netanyahu being there was not a coincidence. I mean, I think it was a gift to Bibi. So no, I think that in many ways Trump would like to show that he's powerful militarily, and I think that the way he will do that is to do it against countries that can't harm America militarily. So I think Iran is a perfect example of that. And plus, he has a history of doing it. Now, the question is, where will America's greatest ally be? Where will the Brits be in this? Are they going to help?
Um, I don't think so. I don't think you know when you're in the UK, people don't really it's not like a hot issue, the discussion about Iran and Iran getting a nuclear weapon. When you have a centre-left government or a centrist government there now in the UK, I don't think the Labour Party, which is obviously still in many ways the party of Tony Blair, um, is still sort of suffering from the mantle of going into Iraq with the Americans. And so I think that makes the ruling party in the UK very, very reticent to, follow America into sort of any Middle Eastern conflict. That said, I do think Britain, which I would generally sort of describe as a declining power, has a really surprising amount of influence in Syria and the new Syrian leadership. The Brits have been working very, very closely with Ahmed al-Shara, and it's interesting because this is a place where Britain hasn't traditionally had influence, and now I think they actually have a lot of influence with the new Syrian presidency, and America isn't really speaking to them. So if the UK is going to be active again in the Middle East, it's got those long-standing relations with the Gulf states, but it could play quite an interesting role in Syria.
Well, as Donald Trump likes to say, Keith Starmer versus Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
Well, listen, sadly, we've run out of time. It's always great to see you, Gareth. You stay safe, and it's just always good to hear your perspective because it's always very balancing. Once again, congratulations on your interview, and the Economist's interview, and the whole team's interview led by Gareth Browne, I would say. But anyway, thanks a lot. It's a pleasure seeing you. And thanks for being with me, Dane Waters, for Around the World with Dane Waters. We will see you next week, same time, same place. Thank you very much.